So, this is what I've been working on. This is a stack, apart from the middle, of a bunch of digital to analog converters, including, well, yes, if you've observed, 2 Bifrost 2s. Now, for those of you who have randomly stumbled across this video and wondering what the heck is a Bifrost 2, or actually a 264 in the case of the upper one, it is a digital to analog converter, or DAC, which you usually plug into a computer or CD player, and also into a hi-fi system or head-fi system like the amp in the middle, and it does a good quality conversion of your preferred audio music into an analog signal, and that you listen with your hi-fi or head-fi system. Now, in the case of the company that I'm dealing with today, Schiit Audio, they were founded by Jason Stoddard and Mike Moffat, the latter of whom is quite famous for working for Theta Digital, making some high-quality DACs, and also an analog-to-digital system for MOFI, with which a number of very famous albums are recorded, such as those of Muddy Waters, and those albums sound absolutely fantastic. So you could say that Mike does know a thing or two about digital. He's also credited with making the first, or one of the first, separate digital to analog converters, as previously you could only get them, well, in a CD player, this way back when digital was pretty much all on CDs. So today we're looking at the second iteration of this DAC here, the Bifrost 2, and it's called the Bifrost 264. These other DACs I'm going to talk about later, including the Topping Centaurus, which a number of you have probably been bugging me to do my review of. Now, of course, the Bifrost 2 is maybe dead on in the middle of a range of 5 different levels of DACs with Schiit Audio. So the lowest is the DAC card, and the highest is the Yggdrasil, one of which I still have hiding under the desk. Between that, we've looked at the Modi Multibit, which is the small form factor DAC that they produce alongside the Modi, and they just released the new Gungnir 2, which will sit between the big Yggdrasil and the Bifrost 2. The critical thing about all these DACs is they're R2R ladder DACs. Now, you may have a DAC inside your phone or computer, but it's generally a chip that kind of does everything in the kitchen sink, takes the digital signal, turns it into analog, and has a small amplification stage to make the signal loud enough to maybe even power headphones. But these things are pretty crap, which is why people use, of course, higher-end DACs such as these, which have a dedicated power supply, a bit of circuitry, and a whole bunch of other stuff. The thing about Sigma Delta DACs is, which are the most common kind of DAC that usually have on chips, and they do provide really excellent technical measurements to their performance, but generally sound somewhat, well, unmusical, as if there's something missing from the music. So a lot of companies are going back to using R2R DACs, which is the older style, because they still have something of that quality that old DACs had, where you feel like you're listening to music and not listening to like a kind of fake reproduction of it. So in that, of course, Schiit Audio went with using industrial chips, which are normally used for motor control in things such as MRI machines and missiles. As unlike regular DAC chips, for controlling something like a motor, you need bit-perfect results. You need absolutely exactly the amount of motor movement you need. But for audio, they weren't really designed, but Mike Moffat was clever and got around that. And the reason he used industrial DAC chips rather than audio DAC chips is because, well, R2R DAC chips just simply aren't made anymore. The only other option is to make your own resistor ladder using a lot of high-precision resistors, which has its own problems. So, yeah, he was stuck with that. Now, the reason I have 2 Bifrosts in here at the moment, of course, is because I have the original Bifrost here, and I decided alongside with Jason Stoddard that I'd hold on to 2 of them so that every time there is an upgrade to the Bifrost, he can just send me a card with the upgrade, and I can just stick that in instead. Yes, you can actually upgrade these. You can pull out the digital analog circuit board and just pop a new one in. And there's also a micro SD card slot, which I'm going to have to see where my finger goes on the camera, in which you can put in upgraded firmware and it will automatically upgrade itself. Now, they also had the option to upgrade the Unison USB system, which is a PIC controller program with their own custom USB implementation. And the purpose of making their own was to make it as basically as good quality as possible without all the extra crap that comes with some commercial designs, although nowadays they can be pretty much customized as required. Now, they haven't felt the need to upgrade the Unison USB because it's pretty good as things go, and I'll talk about that in my impressions. But owners of the original Bifrost 2 now can actually buy the upgrade card for the digital analog conversion and output for $300. And considering that the Bifrost 264 costs $800, that is a significant saving on the upgrade. Now the question is it really a good upgrade to begin with? And well, yeah, let's talk about that. Now, if we're actually comparing these DACs and actually comparing these ones from topping as well, I didn't use the Jotunheim 2, which I have sitting here. I actually used an Audio GD Master 9, which is sitting off camera because it just, let's just say I have a lot of gear on the rack at the moment. To that end, I actually powered the DACs on and left them on for quite some time. Now, to get one thing out of the way, I'll be talking about the topping Centaurus in its own review because it's still new. It's only been here a few days and I've been basically running it in and doing some experiments, and it's more complex than the Schiit Audio Bifrost series. Now, the Bifrost just has a power switch, and other than input select, it only has one other feature, which is you can turn off the digital filtering with a long press of the, well, 4-second press of the input selector. Now, why would you want to do that? Because digital filtering does improve the sound quality. Well, some people either may want to use external upsampling, or they just simply may want the kind of softer and kind of less clear sound of non-oversampling, which is not such a problem if you, let's say you're playing a high-res album that's say 88.2, 96, 176 or 192K. You may not want the oversampling inside the DAC at all and may just want to run it natively using that high resolution. So for example, a 96 kilohertz recording, which is just over double the 44.1 kilohertz of a normal CD quality recording, affects the equivalent of about 2 times oversampling anyway, and pushes all the high frequency noise that would be generated by not having any oversampling way out of the audio band anyway. So you get a kind of more pure result. But either way, that's about as complex as the Schiit Audio DACs get, compared to, say, especially things like topping, which have a bazillion features in the menu system, which, yeah, again, I'll just talk about that in its own review. The idea of what Schiit Audio produces is that you just plug it in and use it. There's no audiophilia nervosa where you're always plugging in tweaks and other things all the time and trying to get it all right. They just make it perfect in the first place. Straightforward linear power supplies inside, everything else using high quality components as much as possible made in the USA. Maybe the only downside to that is if you can see in the video that the color of the aluminium on all 3 of these components is actually slightly different because, well, each batch of aluminium, yeah, over time they've gone through a couple of different manufacturers and, well, they've tried to keep it as simple as possible, and that means cheaper in terms of casing, but so all the money into the design goes into the internals primarily, but also means a little bit of maybe external inconsistency. However, lastly, they do have their own unique remote control, which is worth a kind of visit in its own. It has input selection, a mute function, and a phase invert option in there if necessary. And the cool thing about this aluminium remote control is if you want to change the battery inside, either with a fingernail or there's a little hole in the back you can push through a paper clip, you can actually just pull the circuitry out, the circuit board out. It's just held in by a set of magnets, and change the CR, I think it's a 2025 battery or 2032 battery that's in there already. So it's really very simple. Little setup here and then just set it back in there. Very simple and straightforward and quite unique, unlike the generic topping remotes which seem to be used for everything. But the only probably negative, I think, of this design is the symbols on here are really tiny and on the chassis are really tiny. So if you're trying to figure out what's going on from a distance or you have bad eyesight, yeah, it can be a little bit troublesome, but at least they've got raised buttons that you can feel, so you'll figure it out eventually. In terms of the sound from this DAC, it's easier to talk about something in comparison in that regard. If we think about the old Bifrost 2, which you can see in my video review online, compared to, say, the slightly more neutral Yggdrasil and other DACs, it had a very slight warm and slight softer sound with maybe slightly less clarity than the Schiit Audio's Yggdrasil. I think some people online called it a mini Yggdrasil at the time because of how close it got to the much more expensive Yggdrasil, but for far less money, and it's also far smaller. Now, it depends what you call close in your own opinion, depending on the kind of music you listen to. If you listen to kind of compressed rock, maybe you wouldn't notice so much difference. If you listen to, say, classical or anything very well recorded which has a good amount of space in the recording, you'd probably notice more of a difference. Such as, say, from an Yggdrasil, you'll have better note decay, like you'll hear more of the nuances as notes from instruments decay, and more of what's going on in the space that the music is being played in. However, the slight warmth of the Bifrost 2 made it an interesting pairing with different devices. Sometimes I felt it was a little bit too warm and not necessarily a good synergistic match. Now, since I have the Jotunheim here, which is its kind of natural companion, the pairing, given that the Jotunheim is a little bit kind of tubey sounding, a little bit more deeper than wider, it gave you a kind of old school hi-fi sound that was kind of deep and a touch warm and very pleasant to listen with. Now, the new Bifrost 2 has gone for a sound tuning that's a little bit more kind of cleaner, clearer, and more neutral. And interesting, a little bit closer to, well, some other DACs I'm going to talk about in just a second. And that means if you're thinking of that an R2R DAC is necessarily going to be warm and a little bit more forgiving, maybe such as the Audio GD R2R DACs or a Holo DAC, it definitely is not, and is much more on the neutral side than the previous Bifrost 2. Now, in comparison to other DACs, we looked at the Modi Multibit fairly recently. There's definitely a step up in clarity from the Modi Multibit, better depth to the sound, a better ability to hear into the nuances of what's going on in the music than the Modi Multibit 2. However, there's definitely a similar kind of sound tuning to both of them. It's just simply that the Bifrost 2 has more clarity. And then again, compared to the Yggdrasil, you get another step up. The soundstage, which in the Bifrost 2, compared to higher end DACs, sounds a little bit more closed in, ends up sounding more open once you get into the Yggdrasil and other high end DACs. Comparing with the Yggdrasil, for example, Mark Ribot, whose album I'm not going to try and pronounce since it's Spanish, sounded more open and instrument nuances were definitely more clear from the Yggdrasil. In comparison, guitar plucks are a little bit more one note from the Bifrost, whereas with the Yggdrasil you can hear the harmonics more clearly. Lastly, the echoes from notes around the recording venue are more distinct from the Yggdrasil, and you can hear, well, basically the waves of decay as the notes bounce around the room. Similarly, listening to Sky by, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Youngchen Lamo from Mongolia. Now, the brushing of the drum on the track is more distinct and separated with the Yggdrasil in comparison, while listening through Focal's Utopia 2022 headphones. And note decay, likewise, has maybe a smidgen more clarity with the Yggdrasil, and the difference that shrinks definitely using SPDIF from the Singzer SU1 versus just using the USB inputs. So I can say, at least in the scheme of things, it sits squarely between, of course, the Modi Multibit and the higher end Yggdrasil. And we have yet to see how it compares to the Gungnir 2, which I hope to do in the future. Now, the interesting thing was, well, this is why I have these DACs here. Now, I have two DACs here, the Topping Centaurus, which I'll talk about in its own review, and a Topping D70 Pro Octo. Now, that uses 8 Cirrus Logic chips and is a kind of generic, technically well-performing, but given Cirrus Logic, maybe a touch on the smooth side compared to some of the ESS Tech DACs that are not commonly found in components, like there is a D70 ESS. However, an interesting thing, once I plugged both into the Master 9, made sure they were level matched and started switching backwards and forwards between the channels, is that if I couldn't remember which input was which DAC, I had a lot of trouble discerning between them, and this using the USB input. I actually couldn't initially figure out which DAC I was listening with, so close was the sound that coming out of both of them. Now, there's a couple of little differences here with something like a standard Sigma Delta DAC, which you have in the D70 Pro Octo. When you switch it on, it's going to sound pretty much identical to how it will sound, say, in an hour, unless it happened to have been very cold, like as if the delivery man had just brought it in the middle of winter. However, the Bifrost 2, cold, it sounded a little bit wonky in comparison until it had warmed up and all the resistor ladders had stabilized. And this is a factor of using resistors, is that they are temperature dependent and will actually change their value significantly enough that in an audio component you can hear an audible difference depending on whether they're cold or warm. But anyway, the Bifrost 2 has been here for some time now, and I can confidently say that, having left it on pretty much for months before pulling it off the rack just now to make this video, that I heard it as it was at its best. So to figure out what was going on, I had to go through a lot of music and listen very, very carefully, well, with a bunch of high-end headphones. And in that, what I concluded was, and this is pretty close as things go, was that the Bifrost 2 did musicality ever so slightly better than the D70 Pro Octo. The D70 Pro Octo presents music in a way that, typical of Sigma Delta DAC, sounds a little bit kind of well, it gives everything the same kind of slightly flat coloration. Whereas the Bifrost 2 was a little bit more in the sense of each instrument having its own uniqueness, which is what genuine conversion should do. So for example, a trumpet sounded just a touch more like a real trumpet. Vocals sounded more unique in how they were vocals, and say guitars, maybe guitars, etc. But it was a very subtle thing, and something that, again, initially I couldn't figure out which was which. Now experimentally what I like to do is plug in both DACs, first via USB from my Mac Mini Roon server. Now that has a poor USB implementation, and I can tell that because things like the old Topping D90 sounded a little bit harsh and edgy using the USB input, and the USB input in that probably wasn't so great. But then I switched to a Singzer SU1 DDC and used that as the output to the coax inputs of both DACs. That provided about an equal improvement to both DACs in terms of sound quality, things sounding a little bit more deeper, a little bit more, generally just better, to put it. A little bit more like I was listening to music, whereas the USB sounded a little bit kind of duller, a little bit flatter, a little bit less musical, to use one of those terrible audiophile terms. And in that kind of situation, I think the Bifrost pulled a little bit ahead of the D70 Pro Octo in terms of overall musicality. Now, the only probably disadvantage of the Bifrost 264 versus the D70 Pro Octo is that if you want all these fancy features that the topping DACs have, all the options you can switch, whether you have RCA or XLR output on at the same time or not, and a whole bunch of other stuff you can do, including having Bluetooth input and a fancy VU meter in the screen and all that kind of thing, then of course the D70 Pro Octo is better in that regard. And considering it's not the latest model, and I've been slow reviewing it as things happen, it has gone down in price to, well, basically a couple of $100 cheaper than the Bifrost. Schiit Audio doesn't do sales or discounts. They make a product, they set a price, and as far as possible, they stick to that price. It stays as it is. Whereas the topping gear tends to start at a high price like $9.99 or thereabouts, and then drops down a few $100s over time as the hype dies down. Another DAC I compared it to, which I've reviewed before, is the very popular Gustard R26. Now again, I plugged both of those into the Master 9 and not knowing which was which, had a listen. And one of the DACs was more full and engaging, and the other was a little bit more kind of clear and analytical. And I thought that the Bifrost would be the more full and engaging one. I was wrong. It was actually the Gustard. So a little bit more full and engaging, maybe a touch closer to the Yggdrasil in terms of clarity. And of course, it depends on what input you use and how it sounds. But probably the Gustard's main advantage is that it has network input for those who want to stream directly to the DAC and not just plug it directly in from a computer, something which can result in some sonic improvements. And it also has a wider variety of inputs for people who like going down the tweaking road. Whereas the Bifrost is a basically set and forget kind of thing. You get what you get. And well, you could improve it again by plugging in, like I did, a $700 odd or whatever it is, digital to digital converter. But if you are spending that money, you may as well buy a better DAC in the first place. Although if you do buy a DDC, you can use it on any better DACs you buy in the future. So that comes down to whether it's good value. And I think that's one of those things where, again, so prices you have, Chinese products tend to start high and then go down lower as time goes on to keep the sales up. Whereas Schiit Audio just likes to make solid, steady products as much as possible in the USA that, well, do what they say they do. And as upgrades come along, well, they want users to be able to upgrade them if they so desire for a lot less money. And by not being constantly discounted, you may always just be paying the same price, but if you do sell one on in the future, it won't have dropped value so dramatically that you won't be able to get a good price for it. So finally, this switch to a more kind of neutral and clean sound with the Bifrost 2 means that maybe it has better synergy with other components, especially say the Jotunheim 2, but it does lose some of that unique character which the Bifrost 2 and the Schiit DACs have if they all just sound pretty much the same as everything else. And that's pretty amazing considering that the DACs inside the Bifrost 2 are only 16-bit. So if you look at all the advertising for, say, the topping DACs, they're 32-bit with all this ultra-low harmonic distortion, of course using slightly rigged numbers. But the thing is that I couldn't tell them apart. It shows that you don't need fancy bit and sample rates to get good quality audio in the $500 to $1,000 price range. So as usual, I invite anyone who owns a Bifrost or has jumped to and from the Bifrost to other DACs to post their comments below so that people can get not just my opinion on what the Bifrost 2 is like, but can also get impressions from other actual owners, which is especially helpful if people are thinking of buying a Bifrost, as it can help them decide. Likewise, I have my own private Discord, which you can access by becoming a patron or buying me a coffee. We have an absolutely wonderful group of people, everyone from people who just want a system to set up, through to people who go down that very deep rabbit hole of tweaking and fiddling things around, and everything in between, where we have a lot of fun and help each other out in optimizing our own systems. And they have taught me a lot about things that I can try and do and help me improve my videos. So do consider joining up and joining our great little community if you're interested in improving your audio system. As always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to chatting with you online.